In 2 Peter 1, we saw that very well-known passage where Peter tells the brethren to apply all diligence to supply in their faith moral excellence knowledge, and so on. Talks about those qualities growing in a Christian. And as Peter kind of paints a picture for us here of what God expects of us, that we take the greatest, most positive attributes that we can find, and we incorporate those into our lives. And then we foster those, and we feed those, and we try to grow those to be better and better and more in our lives. And Peter said, if you do this, you'll be fruitful, and the entrance into the eternal kingdom of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ will be abundantly supplied for you. It's kind of like getting in the door. You know, there's sometimes when the door is closing, you barely slip in. This is a picture of God throwing the doors wide open for the individual who does all of these things. And Peter talks about how he's going to continue to remind them of these things. And he closes out chapter 1 talking about how the scriptures and their interpretation, their meaning comes from God. It doesn't come from man. These are not some things that 40 different men made up and wrote out. These are all words of inspiration. Chapter 2, he's going to deal with the opposites of chapter 1. If you've got prophets who teach these things, and you have people who are preaching the word of God, in chapter 2, he's going to say you're going to have false prophets as well. If you have Christians who are growing in their faith and they're becoming better and more Christ-like in their lives, in chapter 2, you're going to find people who are going the opposite direction. They are wicked people, and they seem to just grow more and more wicked as time goes by. And then Peter's going to tell us how God deals with those people. He's already told us what God's going to do for those who have followed him and those who are living the life and working hard to make sure that their calling is certain. But he also is going to tell us that God is able to handle those who are going in the wrong direction. So if you wouldn't mind, let's read down from verses 1 through let's go through verse 9. We're going to interrupt the thought, but for the sake of not having to cover too much at one time, we'll do that. Beginning of verse 1, he says, "But false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them, bringing swift destruction upon themselves. And many will follow their sensuality, and because of them the way of the truth will be maligned. And in their greed they will exploit you with false words. Their judgment from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to pits of darkness reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a preacher of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. And if he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to destruction, by reducing them to ashes, having made them an example to those who would live ungodly thereafter. And if he rescued righteous Lot, oppressed by the sensual conduct of unprincipled men, for by what he saw and heard, that righteous man, while living among them, felt his righteous soul tormented day after day with their lawless deeds. Then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from temptation and to keep the unrighteous under punishment for the day of judgment." False prophets, false teachers. In the Old Testament, God had a couple of tests that he gave the people to be able to identify false prophets or false teachers. How would you or I today be able to identify somebody who's a false teacher? See if it matches with God's word or not. Exactly. Back in Deuteronomy, God had told the people on one occasion, if somebody prophesies something that's going to happen, and he's advising you on what you should do or should not do, wait to see if that thing happens. If it doesn't happen, he's not from me. Don't fear his words. Don't worry about having to do whatever he says. But then again, God said there may be a prophet, not from me, that comes and he prophesies something and it comes to pass. But the things he is telling you are not what I had given you before. In that case, you are not to listen to him. And God explains that he had allowed the thing that happened to happen just to test whether or not the people loved God. Remember what Jesus said in John? If you love me, you will what? Keep my commandments. And the same was true even in the Old Testament. You know, God said, I don't change. And his will doesn't change. And the facts of whether or not you and I love him don't change. The test is the same. Do you follow what God has revealed? He said these people are going to introduce secretly destructive heresies. What is a heresy? What? A false teaching. It's what makes a person a heretic, isn't it? A heresy is something that is not accepted by God, something that had not been taught by God's people, but is introduced later. He said these people are going to bring them in secretly, kind of through the back door. A lot of change that takes place by people who have an agenda is not, direct, straight on. This change is brought about kind of secretly in different stages. It's kind of like the old saying, how do you boil a frog? Remember how you do that? Real slowly. Put that frog in the water he's comfortable in and turn the heat up slowly. And he'll sit there and the change will not even be noticed, and pretty soon he'll be cooked. And you can have frog legs. But when it comes to people, that's not such a good thing. We do allow things to sneak up on us. There are some things if you turn your TV on tonight, you're going to see and hear some things and you're not even going to think twice about them. But I want you to think back a little bit and picture your grandparents back when they were your age, sitting and listening to the same things. How would it have been viewed by them? Quite differently, wouldn't it? They would notice those things. They would say, why are you listening and watching this garbage? And you and I might say, well, I guess we just got used to it. Or we might say, oh, if you think this is bad, you ought to see the things I'm not watching. But that's not going to satisfy them. We have to be very careful because what happens is Satan doesn't just try to shove us over the cliff. He just tries to move us a little bit at a time, slowly over time. They're going to introduce these secretly. And he said eventually they're going to even deny the master who bought them. It's going to begin with one teaching one thing and then another thing, then another thing, until it gets to the point where you're denying Jesus. Now, many people are going to follow them, verse 2. And because of them, the way of truth will be maligned. Because you have false teachers doing the wrong thing, those who are really trying to follow the truth, they're going to be criticized. Whenever you have somebody who's living supposedly the Christian life, and then all of a sudden some dark secrets are uncovered, then the rest of Christianity suffers as a result. The verse 3 tells us their motives, that it's greed. What are some of the things you and I could be greedy about? Money? Okay, tell me how you'd be greedy about time. Don't want to share it with anyone, okay? I'm hoping there's not a hornet in here. Buzzing sound system. Greed comes in different ways. You can be greedy about attention. If y'all have ever had two pets, you know that if you give attention to one, what happens to the other? It's got to get in there, yeah. If you got one dog that won't come to you, all you got to do is get the other one too, and then they're both there. You can be greedy about so many other things. These people are greedy about being followed by other people. They're greedy of the attention. They're greedy of the popularity. And they're probably greedy about money because they will seek to profit. But preachers today, televangelists, are not greedy about money, are they? Okay. Y'all watch any of them? I can't remember. I think it was Will Rogers that said, these preachers all tell you to give God the money, but they give you their mailing address. So be a little cautious about that. Their original intention is to benefit themselves. And they will use false words. And he said, but it might seem like they're profiting. It might seem like they're getting away with it. He said, but their judgment from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. In other words, it might seem like they're going to get off scot-free, but the judge has not rendered his verdict yet for these people. And their destruction, the carrying out of the sentence against them, is not going to just slumber eternally. And then he gives us some examples of how we know that's going to be the case. He said, I want you to think back to angels who sinned. Angels that sinned. He has reserved them to what? The New American Standard said hell. Does anyone have a version that says a different word? Huh? Pits of darkness. Well, it has committed them to pits of darkness, but he cast them into hell. I looked up this word. The word that's usually translated as hell is the Greek word Gehenna. And it refers back to a valley that they threw all their trash there. And the garbage just was always coming in, and they would light it to burn it, but it was always coming in so much that it never went out. So you have this stinking mess of smoke rising eternally is the symbol there of hell. But this isn't that word. This is the word Tartarus. Tartarus is used elsewhere to describe a place of torment that exists for those who are the wicked who die. And it happens immediately. You know, heaven and hell are not really going to happen until day of judgment, until the end of time. But there is a place called paradise. Jesus talks to the thief on the cross. Today you will be with me in paradise. Not quite heaven, but a pleasant place of rest. The rich man and Lazarus, the rich man lifted up his eyes in torment. Literally, he lifted up his eyes in Tartarus. He's not in hell because judgment hasn't taken place yet. One time I remember we asked one of our Bible professors in class, if when you and I die, our eternal fate is sealed, to either go to paradise or to go to torment, what's the difference between hell and torment, the difference between paradise and heaven? And they said, well, there's several different differences, but perhaps the most notable is that one is temporary, the other is permanent. The Tartarus, the torment, takes place until the judgment takes place, and then the full destruction and punishment takes place in hell. Yeah. Yes, Jeff?
This is almost exactly like what Jude writes.
Yes.
Where he's talking about certain people crept in unnoticed, and God's going to take care of them just like, and he gives some examples. Verse 6 said, angels who do not keep their domain but abandon the proper abode they're kept in eternal
Mhm.
It's almost like exactly what Peter was.
Yes. As a matter of fact, when you read 2 Peter 2 and Jude, there are so many similarities. It's like somebody had to be copying off the other one. You know, but we don't know which one. By the way, who is Jude? Who wrote what? Jesus' brother. In the originally he was called Judas. His name was Judas. We've got his name as Jude here because they just could not bring themselves to put as an author of the New Testament book a man named Judas. It would be kind of like naming your daughter Jezebel. It just presents the wrong picture. That's probably the brother of Jesus. James, another brother of Jesus, the most likely author of the book of James. And they both write so similarly. Did y'all hear about the boy that was called to the principal's office? And they said, we're going to flunk you this semester in this one class because you were cheating on the test. He said, well, what makes you think I was cheating on the test? They said, well, your answers were exactly the same as Sammy's answers. And he said, well, maybe Sammy was copying off of me. And they said, well, we thought about that. But on question number 10, in the answer blank, Sammy wrote, I don't know. You wrote, I don't either. So, at any rate, we don't know. We assume that Peter and Jude influenced each other. One of them influenced the other one. And in the writings, we don't know for sure. And if so, we don't know which one penned these words originally. But Jude may have been writing to an audience. If he was the one who copied, he may have been writing to an audience that he felt like needed to hear this, and they might not get Peter's copy of his letter in their lifetime. So that could explain it.
David, even if they were copying each other or not, it was still inspired by God.
Yes. Either way, it still presents biblical truths. So his examples are angels. He starts at the top, doesn't he? Angels. You would figure angels are not going to cross God, but some of them did. Some of them did not continue to obey God. They sinned. And the word for sin here is they missed the mark. That one word for sin in the New Testament. And so God punished them immediately. Then he gives the example of the ancient world. Here's a world that existed before God had given any commands whatsoever except for one, and that was don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Adam and Eve both violated that, but nobody else ate of that because God did away with the garden. He made sure they didn't come back, and we hear no more about any of those, either that tree, and we don't hear more about the tree of life as well until you get into Revelation. But the ancient world, not given any laws, found themselves sinning without restraint. Every thought and intent of their hearts was only wicked. And so God could not tolerate that. And even though they were the vast majority, if they were going to vote for what they wanted to do, they would have won the election. But God said, that's not what I want you to do. So he punished the entire world, and only 7 made it out alive. Then Sodom and Gomorrah. Where was Lot living when the angels had to go get him? He was living in Sodom. Those cities were representation of the most wicked cities on earth. If we think Las Vegas was Sin City, Las Vegas probably could not hold a candle to Sodom and Gomorrah. The point is, you have angels that sinned against God. You got the ancient world that acted wickedly. You had 2 cities that were grossly immoral. And in each case, God brought them to judgment. And in the second case, he rescued the ones who were righteous. And in the third case, he rescues Lot and his two daughters. They're rescued because mainly of his conduct. We're told that he was not happy in Sodom. Perhaps there were other reasons why he was there. We could go into those, but we won't tonight. But at any rate, God's got a message there. It doesn't matter how much wicked seems to be winning the day. It will not win eventually. God brings every wicked person to judgment. And in the meantime, those who are righteous are living in the midst of all of this. God knows how to separate them out. Sometimes we may not do a very good job of separating things out. I used the example before of weeding a flower bed. Have you ever tried to get all the weeds out of a flower bed without harming the flowers? It's really, really hard to do, isn't it? And there have been times when I've weeded the flower bed for someone else, like my mom or my grandma, and a flower didn't survive, but they didn't know it. You can stick those back in the ground, cover it up. A couple days later, they're dead. What happened to that flower? I don't know. I can't do it, but God can rescue the righteous. And he knows how. He did it with Noah and his family. He did it with Lot and his daughters. And so he knows how to do this. So we need to take note of that. Don't think you're going to get lost in the mob. Have you noticed the protests, how they tend to turn violent at nighttime? Especially when people are all wearing masks and hoodies. They think they'll get away with it because the darkness and the disguise is going to cover them. And maybe they will get away from our law enforcement, but they will not get away from God's judgment. No one will. Picking up on verse 10, he said, especially those who indulge the flesh in its corrupt desires and despise authority. And then he tells about how bad these people have gotten. Daring, self-willed. They do not tremble when they revile angelic majesties. Imagine somebody standing in the face of authority and taunting authority. That's what he's showing us here. Whereas angels, who are greater in might and power, do not bring about a reviling judgment against them before the Lord. The angels are withholding judgment. They're not reacting. They're not punishing. He said, but verse 12, these, like unreasoning animals, born as creatures of instinct to be captured and killed, reviling where they have no knowledge, will in the destruction of those creatures also be destroyed. Suffering wrong is the wages of doing wrong. They count it a pleasure to revel in the daytime. Their stains and blemishes, reveling in their deceptions as they carouse with you, having eyes full of adultery and that never cease from sin, enticing unstable souls, having a heart trained in greed, accursed children. Forsaking the right way, they have gone astray, having followed the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness. But he received a rebuke for his own transgression. For a dumb donkey, speaking with the voice of a man, restrained the madness of the prophet. These are springs without water, and mists driven by a storm, for whom the black darkness has been reserved. For speaking out arrogant words of vanity, they entice by fleshly desires, by sensuality, those who barely escape from the ones who live in error, promising them freedom, while they themselves are slaves of corruption. For by what a man is overcome, by this he is enslaved. We're going to stop for a moment. You cannot, I think, paint a more bleak picture of a person who is irredeemable. And I say irredeemable because that's how he has described them. He said they are like creatures of instinct to be captured and killed. Did you know there are some animals that you and I just cannot domesticate? We might think we can. I was reading here a while back about something I had heard before. There's a woman who had is either a python or a boa constrictor, I forget which, but she had been raising it for a long time since it was just a little snake, and she slept with it. And she got worried about it because it quit eating. She would have mice for it and things like that, and it would not eat. And she took it to the vet to find out why this snake wouldn't eat. And the vet asked her about the conditions at the house, where the snake was living, and what their practices were. And then he found out she was sleeping with a snake in her bed. And he said, I've seen this before. Sometimes when a snake is presented with a large potential meal, it will stop eating the small meals to make room for the larger meal. So if you've ever skipped candy or cake or something like that because you want to leave room for supper, that's what this snake was doing. It was skipping all those little things because it was going to eat her. And fortunately, she found out that before it was too late. But that's an instinct of animals. They react a certain way because that is the way they are. And Peter has said these people have become those kinds of creatures. They have no knowledge. They enjoy doing wrong. They revel in doing wrong. They don't care if people see them or not. And he said they have just forsaken the right way and they want to go astray. And it's hard for us to believe that, but it is true. Just as at one time, different nations had thought that if you have a nation led by a ruler who wants to wage war, all you've got to do to get them to leave you alone is just say, well, we're not going to fight you. We think if we do good to you, you will just abandon your wrong ways. That's the course that Neville Chamberlain followed with a man named Adolf Hitler. And we know how that turned out. Didn't turn out very well at all. So at any rate, it doesn't work with some individuals. He mentions Balaam here. Y'all remember the story of Balaam? Long before Dr. Doolittle, Balaam talked to the animals. Or at least one animal. And it talked back to him. Wouldn't it be, donkeys are usually known for what traits? Stubbornness. Are they usually known as creatures of great intelligence? No. And yet, this donkey is smarter than Balaam. He sees things that Balaam didn't see. He saw the angel that was going to slay Balaam for his actions against God when Balaam didn't see it. Balaam eventually blesses Israel every time that he had been asked to curse Israel. But we're told later he became an enemy of Israel. And what we figure had happened was Balaam finally told this king, God will never curse this people. But you can get them to curse themselves if you can lead them into sin. He wanted a payday. He saw the riches he was offered to get a curse upon Israel, and he was determined to get it one way or another. And that's the picture that Peter paints here of these people. They may be thwarted from time to time in their efforts to be evil and to do evil, but they are intent on getting it done one way or another. He said, but Balaam at least received a rebuke. These people don't even listen to rebukes. What does he describe in verse 17? What's the basic idea there? Huh? drought. You're thirsty and you find a spring, there's no water. It promises something because it's a spring, but there's nothing there to sustain life. They are that. They are mist driven by a storm. If you're in the middle of a drought, here comes a mist. It's like a heavy dew. How much good does it do? None at all. Does not water the parched land. He said these people make promises of things they cannot deliver on. They promise freedom while they themselves are enslaved. Imagine being in prison and you are behind the bars and there's barbed wire outside. And there's a guy in your cell. He's been there for 25 years. He says, "You want to get out of here? I know how to get out of here." Really? If you're so smart, how come you didn't get out here 24 years ago? No, it's a promise that's not going to be kept. Looking down verse 20 through the end, for if after they have escaped the defilements of the world by the knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, they are entangled in them and are overcome, the last state has become worse for them than the first. For it would have been better for them to not have known the way of righteousness than having known it, to turn away from the holy commandment delivered to them. It has happened to them according to the true proverb, a dog returns to its own vomit, and a sow after washing returns to wallowing in the mire. If there's anything in the world that's worse than never having heard about Jesus Christ, it's to have heard about him and then fall away. I one time asked a class upstairs, a teenage class, it's been years and years ago, do you think that somebody on the other side of the world who's never heard about Jesus, never heard about God, never been taught, do you think they could go to heaven? What do you think the majority of the class thought? No, they said yes. I said, how would they get to go to heaven? Well, by living the best life they could. I said, if a people can be saved and go to heaven by living the best life they could, then why did Jesus find it necessary to go to the cross and die on the cross? Why would the Son of God come here and let men crucify him if there was another way? We one time asked a math teacher, how do you figure out the square root of a number? And he went up on the board, he started writing on the board, he filled up half of the chalkboard, huge chalkboard, with this way of finding the square root. And someone raised their hand and they said, well, in the very back of the math book, it gives the square roots of numbers. He said, well, yeah, if you want to do it the easy way. Guess what? We wanted to do it the easy way. So I talked with the class and they realized, well, then they really can't be saved. And I said, plus, when you think about it, if they can be saved without hearing about Christ, let's just say that we go over there and we tell them about Christ and they reject Jesus. Can they still go to heaven? They said, no way. I said, so then we would mess up their one chance to get to go to heaven by telling them about Jesus Christ. And so now they don't trust me to answer any other questions I ever ask them. And I said, here's what the deal is. Those people cannot go to heaven, but they will not go to hell because they disbelieved in Jesus, because they never heard of Jesus. If they suffer, they will suffer because of things they did that were wrong. In Luke, Jesus is going to tell a parable about servants. He said, the servant who knows his master's will and does not get ready in accordance to his master's wishes will be beaten with many stripes. The servant who did not know his master's will, yet committed deeds worthy of a beating, shall be beaten with few stripes. So you're faced with the option here of many or few if you don't want to accept Jesus. You heard about the guy that rolled through a stop sign? Highway patrolman pulled him over. He said, "Sir, I'm going to have to write you a ticket. You ran a stop sign." He said, "But sir," he's officer, "I slowed down. That's the same thing." And according to the story, the highway patrolman pulled out his nightstick, started beating on him. Wham, 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 wham. The guy's screaming and yelling, and the highway patrolman says, "Now, do you want me to slow down or stop?" Bottom line here is, you and I face a great danger if we leave Christ now, because we know him. We have been saved from the defilements of the world. And if we turn back to the world, the worst punishment that could happen to any man is going to take place. We'll be in chapter 3 next week.